Dog Works Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find all of our episodes over on DogWorksRadio.com, and be sure to check us out on social media by searching DogWorks Radio. And calling in from Southern California is our co-host, Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going today?
It's going really well, Robert. We're recording this right before the new year, and it's kind of exciting. We have a lot of things have happened in the past couple of weeks. It feels like it's been a little bit, not a lot has happened recently, but we've sort of made up for it in the past couple of weeks, and I am starting to get very excited about the upcoming race season.
I am too, and we're going to break this up. This is, again, sort of an off-season update show. We're going to break this up into a couple of sections. We're going to talk about some qualifying races first, and then we're going to talk a little bit about one of our friends that is entering his rookie year of Iditarod, and then some unfortunate passings in the Iditarod community. So let's start off with the qualifying races. First up, they had the first Iditarod qualifier. I believe it was last weekend. They did a Alpine Creek 200 and 300 mile race. And what's interesting about this, Alex, is the 300 mile race only had 4 participants in it. This is a brand new race. It's put on by the same folks that do the Alpine Creek Excursions race, which is typically the first race of the year up here in Alaska. And our friend Nick Pettit won the race. And this was interesting because it was not a timed race. It just, whoever started and whoever finished first was the winner. And, of course, the other 3 came in within about an hour or two after Nick. And then they did the 200-mile race, and what was interesting with that is Jeff King won his first ever Red Lantern Award. And I find that really, really interesting because he's been mushing for, 40 years or so, but also on the same token, he won the race as well. So he not only claimed first prize, but he came last prize as well because he was the only entrant in the 200-mile race. What are your thoughts on that, Alex?
I think it's kind of an amazing thing. Not only is Jeff King a really interesting guy and a very, very well regarded musher and 4-time winner of the Iditarod, but it's fascinating to me that he has never won a Red Lantern before. And it's also interesting that there were so few entries in this race. And, we've talked a little bit over the years about the difficulties in starting up a new race and getting people excited about it, getting all of the logistics in place and getting people to enter. But it's kind of fascinating that a race like this, a relatively new race like this, that has 2 Iditarod champions entering it, would have trouble drawing people in as entries. So that's kind of fascinating to me.
It is, and as we mentioned, the Alpine Creek Excursions race, which is more or less a 120-mile fun run, that had pretty much a who's who of mushing involved. I know Lance Mackey was involved, and the Barringtons were involved, and several other of the big names in mushing were in that race, and that was just a weekend before. And I would first think that it had to do with the poor snow conditions, in particular here in the Matsu Valley, but almost all of these big-name mushers are going up to the Denali Highway where this race is ran, both of these, the shorter one and the qualifiers, and that is prime mushing ground up there. They've had snow up there, and I believe have been on runners since October. Let's move over to the next race. It is the Connect 200. About a month ago, they posted on their website and on Facebook that they were going to have to cancel the race for the second year in a row, and that's predominantly the first qualifying race of the year, and it's held the first weekend in January. So unfortunately, the Connect 200 has decided to not run the race this year. But for some good news, the Kuskokwim 300 race, which is held, I believe, the third weekend of January, they have announced that they have the second highest purse in all of dog sports, $160,000 purse for the 300-mile race, and then I believe a combined purse of over $300,000 in the races that work in conjunction with that. They do a couple of shorter races along with that 300, and of course, over there they do some sprint mushing as well. That's a heck of a lot of money for a 300-mile race, isn't it?
It really is, and I think that that's that shows that although, as we've talked about a lot on this show, the sport of mushing is going through kind of a transitional period, and there are some people who have doubts about the long-term viability of mushing as a sport and of some of these larger races and more well-known races. But then you hear something like this, and that's something that I think gives me and a lot of people a lot of hope that there could be a really, really bright future for this sport.
I'm looking forward to it. That's always the what they call the richest race in mushing. They have always had huge purses, and they draw a lot of the big teams. You're thinking about Nick Pettit and Lance Mackey and Jeff King and Martin Booser. All of those guys have run that race before. Also, rounding out the month of January is the Copper Basin 300, which is the weekend before the K300, and then at the end of the month, and then saddling February, is the Willow 300, and that's one of the very few races that does a mass start, where all the teams start at the same time, and it starts over on Willow Lake, which is the same spot of the Iditarod restart, and that's always fun to watch, that 300-mile race getting kicked off with 30, 40, 45 teams all jumping off at the same time, and just a stampede across that lake there, and then it narrows into a really, really narrow trail as soon as they exit the lake. I know you've been in that particular section many times, haven't you?
Yeah, and it's a very cool section to be in, and you can get like really great views of the teams as they're coming by. So it's a really good place to be.
So earlier you learned about First Paw Coffee Company, and now I'm going to tell you about its Tail Wagger Blend. First Paw Coffee Company's Tail Wagger Blend is their first offering, and its name and label were crowdsourced from their Facebook fans. How cool is that? The Tail Wagger Blend is a private label premium blend that was developed just for them. It is a medium roast from Colombian beans with tastes of Brazil nuts, grapefruit, and oak. Be sure to go to ak.dog/free and enter to win a bunch of cool prizes. That's ak.dog/free.
So let's next move over to talk about one of the upcoming rookies in the race. And we talked a heck of a lot about his wife last year, and the Ugly Dogs. We covered them just about every day on our Iditarod coverage. What do you know about Quince Mountain, and what is he doing leading up to this year's Iditarod?
So apparently there were a couple of people who entered at the last minute. Some we talked about, some we haven't, to avoid the late penalty for Iditarod. And one of them that kind of snuck in a little bit under the radar was Quince Mountain. And Quince is, has been one of our friends, one of our Twitter buddies for a long time. I think the very first or the second year that we were doing this show together, our Iditarod coverage, Quince was one of the people who we would stay up all night with tweeting during the race, and it's very exciting to me that he's entering Iditarod. I thought that they were going to wait and he would run it next year, but apparently he got all of his qualifiers lined up and everything fell into place, so he entered at the last minute. And there's a lot of things that are exciting about Quince entering the race, but one of them is that we've talked about this phenomenon of the Ugly Dogs before, and they just really Quince and Blair Braverman have really kind of energized and motivated so many people, and it is so exciting to see all of these people who are who follow Quince and Blair on social media, on Twitter and various other places, and just what they are motivated to do. And one of the more amazing and exciting things is that when he decided to run Iditarod, and after he had entered, Quince put up a GoFundMe page, and it's not unusual for people to put up GoFundMes for various things, and I know a bunch of Iditarod mushers have had GoFundMes to help offset their Iditarod expenses, and so he put it out there, and he tweeted about it and posted a video about his feelings about entering the Iditarod, and Blair tweeted about it, and they had a goal of trying to raise $50,000 to offset the costs of him running the Iditarod this year. And within, I believe it was just over 48 hours, or it might even have been slightly under 48 hours, but in any event, it was like in just about 2 days, the Ugly Dogs raised the entire amount of this $50,000 GoFundMe. And one of the more amazing things when they get motivated and when the Ugly Dogs, kind of kick into action is we're not talking about, 20 people giving a couple $1,000s each. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people giving relatively small donations. There were a lot of donations that were in the $10 and $20 and $30 range. So it takes a lot of those to add up to $50,000. So it is a very exciting thing, and I think that what that says to me is that there are a lot of people out there who are excited about Iditarod and that can be reached in ways maybe that the race hasn't reached them before. So I think it's really fantastic, and I am very much looking forward to seeing what he does on the trail this year.
I am too, and I was amazed by that outpouring of support. And just like you said, just a couple of days, he had that full thing funded, and I think that that's awesome. And I do think that we are sort of at that tipping point in terms of how folks follow the race and how they contribute to the race and whatnot, because for so many years it's been sort of the old guard doing things as they do, and things aren't like that anymore, in particular the way folks are attracting sponsors. And I know you and I talked in another episode about the Q-Paws race series that's going to take place this year, starting with the Bear Grease. But what are your thoughts on that? People consume media much different these days. And we've talked about the ugly dogs for quite a while, and their real force is on Twitter. And a lot of folks just don't use Twitter. I know mushing is one of the few sports that has really embraced it. But how do you see this sort of playing out? And I bring that up because we often parallel other sports with this. I know that the NFL is trying real hard to embrace Twitter through their coverage on Thursday nights and on Amazon Prime, where they're hosting the Thursday night game not only on Amazon Prime and NFL Network, but also live on Twitter to try to capture that audience. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know that you're very active on Twitter, but do you think that that's the right place to be, or is there something else that may be better? What are your thoughts?
I think that it depends on the individuals. I think that Blair and Quince have found a way to use Twitter and to get people motivated in Twitter that works extraordinarily well for them. Other people have found other platforms that work really well for them. But I think that, and I don't want to speak for Blair or Quince because they're perfectly capable of, they're both very smart and incredibly articulate and can speak for themselves very easily and do. But what I have noticed about them is that they not only are very interested in mushing and in furthering the sport, but they're both kind of natural storytellers, and they both have embraced this thing that some people have been calling the Twitter of good, which is the idea that that not only are we involved either as fans or as participants in this sport, but we're also looking for ways to form more of a human connection. And we saw that with the way the Ugly Dogs took to the fundraising efforts during last year's Iditarod, and within a very short amount of time raised well over $100,000 for community projects, mostly educational projects and mostly having to do with natives in the state of Alaska. And that was very exciting to see. So I think that they have, in addition to everything else that they've done, they've tapped into this idea that I think everybody these days is looking for a little bit more human connection. And they've found a way to do that through social media, which for a lot of us sometimes can be very, can be a little bit on the antisocial because people are very factional and people love to have arguments on social media. But they've found a way to turn that on its head and to really embrace the idea of we can do a lot of good with social media. And in my mind, that explains a lot of why people are so excited about the two of them and about what they're doing on social media.
Well, Alex, a heck of a lot of other dog mushers have taken note of Blair and Quince's relative success on Twitter, and you'll see a heck of a lot of them have Twitter pages now, and they're trying to do some of the same sort of things that Blair and Quince are doing, telling the stories and whatnot. Let's stick with this for just a second. And you and I have been very active, as we said, on Twitter for many years, not only during Iditarod season, but on a daily basis, talking about a variety of topics. But you and I are also on the other platforms as well. I'm pretty heavy on Instagram. I don't think you are as much as I, but both you and I are active Facebook users as well. What are your thoughts about being on several platforms, but posting the exact same content on Twitter to Facebook or Facebook to Twitter and vice versa? Do you think that that's effective, or do you think that they should have their own place? Because they are very different animals, aren't they?
They really are, and there are some things that are much easier to do on some of the platforms. Like, for example, it's much easier to do video and to do much longer video on Facebook than it is on Twitter. This is something that wrestle with all the time because I sort of inherently want there to be. I don't want the social media experience to be the same on each platform, but I'm not quite sure how to divide it up. And as you mentioned, I believe I have an Instagram account, but I can't remember when the last time was that I posted something on Instagram. So I recognize that I should use that more, but it's just not. It's not something that's really in my wheelhouse at the moment. So I haven't developed a plan for it. And I know that people who are real social media experts tell me all the time that no, Instagram is good for this particular thing, and Twitter is good for this thing, and Facebook is for something else. So I'm not quite sure how to really use all of those effectively. And I think that a lot of people sort of default to doing the same content on each platform because it's relatively easy. And what we want to do is we want to have the social media presences really be adding to the overall experience and not to become, essentially jobs that you have to do for 20 or 30 hours a week without getting paid for them.
So last question in regards to this social media presence in terms of mushing. What would you like to see in a perfect world? The races covered. If we can just concentrate on the Iditarod, how would you like to see it? Would you like to see a very heavy presence on Facebook, which they already do well? They don't do as much on Twitter, but other feeds pick it up, like the ADN and some other news outlets do a very good job with that. And then, of course, Instagram. How do you want to consume the Iditarod moving forward here in this this new decade as we're moving into 2020?
Oh, if I ran the world, which very clearly I do not, but if I could choose like my ideal way for it to happen, I would love to see a lot more people mushers posting stuff about individual dogs. I'd like to really, not just get to know the mushers and their personalities, but really get much more of a feeling for the personality of the dogs. And so that's my first thing that I would like to see. And then my second thing is just more stuff that focuses on the people who aren't the contenders to win the race. The middle of the pack people and the back of the pack people is always where I think my heart goes.
I agree with you, and I definitely agree with the dog thing. And what's interesting? Also, we talked about other people jumping on the Twitter platform. There's a heck of a lot more podcasts out there now in regard to mushing. I know that Erin Montgomery, who was the teacher on the trail a few years ago, has a mushing podcast now, and what she does is she has her students interview mushers for her show. I think that's a really cool thing, and of course, the local NPR affiliate does a podcast during Iditarod, and I think now that the ADN is doing one as well. But even podcasts are popping up about the sport of mushing, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. And having kids interview mushers, I think, is just genius because people are much more relaxed around kids, and kids can generally get people to say things that they might not say in an interview with adults. So I just think that is a fantastic approach for a podcast.
It will be interesting to see how the 2020 race plays out with Quince in the race, and how the Ugly Dogs and their fan force takes charge of it. It'll be fun to follow as it was last year. As we mentioned at the top, I think we talked about the Ugly Dogs just about every night during our coverage. So, Alex, let's switch over to a more somber topic now. We're going to talk about a couple of recent passings of folks that were involved with Iditarod pretty much from the very beginning. Let's start with Bud Smith. What do you know about his passing in the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, so Bud Smith passed away on December 14th. He was the very first musher to leave in the very first Iditarod in 1973. He ran the Iditarod a bunch of times. I believe he finished it 6 times. He also was one of the people who was responsible for founding the Yukon Quest race. And we have a lot of people who every year are saying things like, well, the Iditarod isn't the same as it used to be, and it used to be a much more difficult race, and it used to be much more about survival and about being at one with the with the elements. And Bud Smith is someone who was saying that exact same thing in the early 1980s, when the Iditarod was still, kind of in the Wild West phases. It hadn't quite become the well-oiled machine that it is these days. So he was feeling like the Iditarod had become too easy, and was one of the people who started the Yukon Quest, wrote the race rules for the Yukon Quest for its first year, was one of the people who went out and selected the trail and helped break the trail for the original Yukon Quest races, which he wanted to be more difficult from Iditarod, not having as many checkpoints, having longer stretches between checkpoints, and also having more challenging sections in terms of elevation gain and that kind of thing. He had 10 children with 2 different wives, had done a number of different things in Alaska. There is a great obituary for him in the Matsu Valley Frontiersman, and I wanted to just read a tiny bit of that towards the end. It says, his 10 children were included in everything he did, for better or worse. With his passion for perfection and self-reliance, for discovery and truth, he gave them uncountable experiences and insights in the wilderness and at home. His children cherished these father gifts and cultivate them for their own children. He taught his children about things we must do for the good of the world, and they carry the torch they received from him. The flame of his love burns bright and hot. And that is kind of a fantastic thing to say about anyone. He was a real kind of typical Alaskan type of guy, the kind who does a million things, is constantly reusing old materials rather than relying on getting things new like we tend to do down here in the lower 48. He also is the father of Iditarod veterans Ramey Smith and Sim Smith, and is just someone who had a real larger-than-life impact on Alaska and especially on the sport of mushing. And I know that a lot of people are going to miss him very, very much. He seems almost like the type of man who's literally from another time, and I wonder sometimes reading his obituary in the Frontiersman if that's the type of guy that maybe is starting to be gone for good.
Alex, I had a chance to meet Bud Smith on a few occasions, and he was always very gracious to me and my family. A couple of quick stories about Bud. First off, he was one of the founding members of the Klondike 300 qualifying race. It started over in Big Lake and went on for many years. That morphed into the Northern Lights 300 race, and then that morphed into eventually the Willow Tug race, Willow Tug 300, and now what we know as the Willow 300. That race has sort of morphed into all of that, with Bud being involved for many years with that race. But a thing that also I'd like to say about Bud, and you may know this answer better than I, wasn't he, the musher in Iditarod, responsible for the 16 dog, which is now a 14 dog limit in Iditarod, because he showed up one year with a really long string of dogs? That's my first question. And secondly, wasn't he one of the first folks that was traveling down the trail using a cooker on the trail, cooking up his dog food? And I think there's pictures out there of a stovepipe that's sticking out of his sled bag. I believe he is responsible for both of those. Do you know that, Alex?
I don't know that offhand, but I think that those are both correct.
He was a character, and he will definitely be missed, not only in the mushing community, but in the great state of Alaska all around. And as you mentioned, both Ramey and Sim are heavily involved with Iditarod in very recent times. Next, let's talk about Mitty Johnson. I know you and I talked about him on our last episode on our review of the Togo movie, but what can you tell our listeners about Mitty?
So Mitty Johnson is a guy who is sort of synonymous for Iditarod fans with the checkpoint of Unalakleet. He's a Unalakleet native, lived there all of his life. He ran the Iditarod once in 2010, finished out of the money, but had a really great time. And he said that he was particularly struck when he was traveling on the Iditarod Trail by a lot of the checkpoints, and how the checkpoints had sort of their own, flavor and their own style. And he wanted to make the Unalakleet checkpoint more memorable and more accommodating and more more something that would be thought of well by the mushers. So he, after running Iditarod in 2011, he started this tradition of making pancakes and making these huge breakfasts for mushers. And he would make thousands and thousands of sourdough pancakes over the years. And he had two brothers who also were Iditarod veterans. And perhaps most importantly, and what we talked about last time, I think, was that his grandfather was one of the participants in the 1925 Serum Run, and his grandfather was actually Henry Ivanov was the guy who handed off the Serum to Leonard Seppala. And as people might recall, Seppala was not aware when he started out that there was going to be a relay, and that was decided after he had already left Nome. So Seppala wasn't aware of it, and Henry Ivanov actually passed him on the trail, and then yelled after him and chased him down and got Seppala to come back and get the serum and then be on his way back towards Nome. So this is someone who had a really strong, family involvement with mushing for many, many decades. I had thought that he was at one point the mayor of Unalakleet, but I couldn't verify that, and I'm thinking now perhaps it was one of his brothers who was the mayor of Unalakleet. And I met him a couple of times when I was doing my documentary, and he was incredibly friendly, incredibly open, and incredibly gracious with me, and answered all of my silly questions with real good humor and real affection towards the sport and towards anyone who was interested in the sport. And he was very young. I think he was only 53 when he died. So that is another great loss for the Iditarod family.
Alex, you had talked about his grandfather being involved in the original serum run in 1925, and we have an interesting story here. Just a few days from his passing, Mitty Johnson was working with us in our planning of the 2020 serum run trail expedition. He was our contact for Unaclete. He was helping us set up accommodations for lodging there, and our good friend Stephanie Masters Johnson, who lives in Nome, is handling that part of the serum run lodging, and she had just spoken to him a couple of days before, and he was really excited that the serum run expedition had picked up again, and was excited for the Togo movie coming out and all of that. And it truly shows that this man was involved with mushing his entire life up until the very last few days of his life, and I think that is something that we should honor for sure. Because, as you said, Alex, we're sort of changing the guard here, and mushing in general is changing, and of course, Iditarod and that sort of thing are unfortunately losing a lot of those founding members, aren't they?
They are, and I just wanted to make one other point. I think, and I know I'm guilty of this, definitely, but I think there's a tendency to think that people are only mushers when they compete in races, and that they're that someone who has a dog team and they run them recreationally, or they run them for fun, or they don't have enough dogs to be really competitive, that they don't count as real mushers. And I think that even though Mitty Johnson only ran the Iditarod once, this is someone who was involved with dogs and with dog sledding from when he was a little kid, and definitely had it in his family going back generations. And even though he didn't run the Iditarod more than once, and he didn't run many races recently, this is someone who was a musher, because he was involved with dogs and because he was involved with the races, even if he wasn't competing. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot more to mushing than just the races. And anyone who runs dogs, anyone who has even a tiny dog team, even like 3 or 4 dogs that they take out on a sled, that's a musher. And I know that I lose track of that sometimes. I think probably you don't as much, because you are out there with your dogs every day. But that's an important thing for fans to remember.
It is, and it truly is a lifestyle. I know that we say that, and a lot of fans may think that that's just a cliche, but it is truly a lifestyle. Whether you have, a very small team of just 4 or 5 or 6 dogs, or a big kennel like some of these tour kennels, it's a lifestyle that we live and breathe every day. It's something that I think about all of my waking hours, and often in my dreams at night are things that I'm thinking about on the dog trail. So, Alex, we're just about out of time. Anything else you want to mention in closing?
Yeah, just have one very brief thing. There is a new Drake video, the rapper Drake, in which he is wearing a Lance Mackey limited edition Canada Goose parka. And you can just see it very briefly when he turns his back, that it says Lance Mackey on it. And Lance Mackey said that he got a big kick out of it, although when people started telling him on Christmas that his name was in this new Drake video, he said, well, I know the name, but I'm not sure I'm familiar with any of his music. And I said this afternoon on Twitter that there is a great promotional opportunity there. And so I think Drake should be Lance Mackey's Iditarider for the 2020 Iditarod.
That would be interesting, wouldn't it? And people as they are, that limited edition coat, they were only on sale for a little while. I guess some of them are going for $3,000 or $4,000 on eBay right now, and I think that they're claiming that the one that's used in the video, I believe, is on eBay at the time that we're recording for $18,000. And it's interesting that
wow.
Lance Mackey had said in an article today that Canada Goose was going to make this limited edition coat, and they asked him to send in his coat that he wore. I believe it was in the 2011 Iditarod. So he sent him this smelly dog coat to get, so they could redo this limited edition. And I guess he just got it back last year, if I remember correctly in the article, and he got it back when he was in Paris, if I'm not mistaken, Lance Mackey in Paris at a fashion show, and he wore this coat. Am I just dreaming about this, or is that what the article said?
that sounds right. Speaking of clothing and parkas, we were talking about last week about the great costumes in the Togo movie, and I read recently that there is a sort of mandate from Disney not to use real fur in any of their costumes for their live action things. So they actually made fake fur versions of these very warm-looking, very authentic-looking fur coats for the Togo movie, which I found kind of fascinating because it wouldn't have occurred to me that it wouldn't be okay to use actual fur in a period piece at a time when certainly everyone in Nome and in that part of Alaska was wearing actual fur coats. But apparently the costume designer was tasked with doing all of this without using any actual fur.
They were remarkable. I thought for sure, and of course I didn't know that when I watched the movie, but my goodness, that was some great craftsmanship. It looked 100% realistic, as if it were the seal hides and all of that. They looked 100% authentic, and I tell you what a way to do the costuming the way that they did it there. Alex, we are definitely over time. We will definitely be back on the air more as we move into the mushing season here in the weeks and months to come. And make sure to follow us on social media by searching Dogworks Radio. And Alex, how can folks find you on social media, since that was a big topic of today's show?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Coldfoot Films and on Facebook at Alex M. Stein.
There you go. You can find me by just typing in my name, Robert Forto, on both Twitter and Facebook. I'm pretty active on both, and we will always reply to all of those tweets, even if they are at 3 o'clock in the morning. Alex, it's been a pleasure to have you on today. We'll see you again soon, okay?
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio. Did you know that Alaska Dogworks trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dogworks on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.